want you to get used to this formula of looking at these quarters. So what we left behind in the morning session, we stopped at the 24th gate. That is the 24th gate, the return part of the cross of the four ways. And that the next step is that we enter into the second gate. And of course, the second gate is the gate of the driver, and it's the gate of the driver for the three gates of the Sphinx. So we started with the 13th gate in Aquarius. The 13th gate in Aquarius, again, a gate of the Sphinx. In other words, we're stepping into the second quarter, but we're stepping into the second quarter meeting the second variation of the same cross. In other words, we're going to meet here the cross of the Sphinx, but we're going to meet the cross of the Sphinx with the sun in the second gate rather than the sun being in the 13th gate. We know that a quarter is based on the first two lines, and you can see this quarter that begins with the second hexagram, you have two yin lines. If you follow all the way around, every single one of the hexagrams that I'm moving through, right up until the 33rd hexagram, the first two lines are all yin-yin. In other words, that's what links these 16 together. By the way, when you're looking at the split, that is that the 16 is broken up into two groups of 8, and this is something that we're going to see repeats as we went through in the first part. What you'll notice in that is that this first group of 8 that goes from the 2 to the 12, that you'll see that the first three lines are all yin. In other words, that's true for 8 hexagrams in a row. They all have a base of 3 yin lines. When you get to the next part, to the 15, you see that the 2 yin remain. That's the harmony for all the 16, but you can see there's now a yang line. And if you look, you'll see that the next 7 hexagrams that follow, they're all yin, yin, yang. In other words, you can see the way these groupings are linked to each other. Remember that a quarter is going to begin. This is the quarter, the realm of Dubhe. This is the quarter of civilization. It begins with the Sphinx gate. It's always going to have a vessel of love in the middle, and then it's going to close, in this case the 33rd gate retreat, with a gate from the cross of the four ways. This is the structure built into these quarters. If you look, those of you that don't have this book, raise this up just so you can see the color pattern. If you look at this and then you look at the throat center, you'll see that every single gate in the throat center is activated through this whole field of civilization. In other words, if we were to give this quarter another name, we could call it the quarter of manifestation. Because this is all about getting things done, building things, making things. It also has obviously a verbal aspect to it, an acoustic aspect to it in terms of being able to articulate and express in so many different ways. But the real basis of this quarter of civilization is the pressure on us to manifest, and the pressure on us to manifest through the holy grail of our design, which is the throat. Everything is about the throat. The throat is where the fetus in its first design form begins. The throat is the whole story. And it's only here with the throat, it's only here with manifestation that we can begin to move away from being clever beasts. And it begins with the second gate, the receptive. Of all of the gates, this one is the most fascinating at a very basic level. It is the place of the driver, that is, it is the place of the magnetic monopole. It is the place of what gives us our illusion of separateness and our connection to our geometry and our movement in space. And when you're looking at the second gate, what you're looking at is the one way in which we are all given direction. We know that through the Sphinx that it can be expressed through its perspectives. That is the abstract perspective, the 13 that looks backward, the 7 that's logical, that looks forward, and the individual that is simply there in the moment. But all of them are being fueled in that sense. All of them are being directed by the second gate. So when you get here to the second variation of the right angle cross of the Sphinx, the 2, the 1, the 13, and the 7, When you get here, you're really getting to the real theme of the entire direction of humanity. Because that's what the second gate always represents. You know, it's one of those things. Design has often brought me to moments of just sheer delight. And one of my sheer delights is about the nature of this direction, this basic direction, this primary cross of direction, because this primary cross of direction has the sun in 2-1. Now the second gate, the first line is all about beauty. It's all about beauty. It's about a direction of beauty. And it's about a direction of beauty whether it's there naturally or whether you have to work hard to get it. And it's one of the most beautiful things to understand about our evolution and our direction is that we're always moving towards what is beautiful. It's something that I find very, very nice. Remember what sphinxes do. They give you direction. But think about the difference. If you meet somebody, like we met at the beginning of our process here, if you meet somebody who's got the sun in the 13th gate and you're standing with them at the supermarket checkout, what you're going to end up being focused on afterwards is looking at the past. Because that's the direction they bring you. You know, they're bringing you that focus through the 13th gate. But when you meet somebody who has this second variation of the Sphinx, they open up everything for you. I mean, that's the beauty of this cross. They open up all possibilities of direction. And one of the things you'll notice about people who carry this cross, but with the sun in the second gate, is that they're much more open to all the possibilities of direction. They're much more open to the many ways of describing things and the many ways of seeing things. And sometimes when you talk to them, they can be a little bit confusing. Because one of the difficulties that they will have is, though they know the direction, it's hard for them to really describe it. They can sort of point to something in the future or point back to something in the past or try to... All they know is the direction. So, you know, you say to them, what should we do? And they say, well, go that way, but they can't help you with anything other than go that way. Everything else becomes confusing. But very, very important forces. Because we're opening up a new realm here, then one of the things to understand is that it is up to us to create the beauty. In other words, we have to make our world, and if we make our world ugly, it's our fault. And if we make our world beautiful, aren't we terrific? You know, but it's our responsibility to do something about it. You could sort of say that this is the genetic code for garbage men, you know? Clean up the mess. There are some people in life that I call signposts. I've had that experience in my life of having a momentary interaction with a total stranger that changed my life. When you get to this juxtaposition cross, you get to such beings. This is the juxtaposition cross of the driver. Now, the first thing to recognize is that when the 13 and the 7 disappear, in other words, the full aspect of the Sphinx disappear, what it's replaced with is the 49 and the 4. Now remember our discussion about the nature of the 49, about its principles, about this is where we first encounter the need to be able to kill and sacrifice. Now think about it. By the time we get to this second realm, it's moved from being the personality sun to being the designed sun. In other words, it's not the main theme anymore, but it certainly is there underneath the surface. And one of the things about the cross of the driver is that this cross is absolutely focused, totally focused on following its direction and trying to pull people in its wake. They know where they're going. And they know where they're going. Now, when I say that, that's what they live out, is that they know, in that sense, where they are going. And that they know where they're going will bring them the necessary truth. And this is the difference. You see, there's all kinds of things that are beautiful. And when you're looking at the right angle, the beauty necessary and manifestation out of the right angle is to make sure that the environment, to make sure that cleanliness, make sure that all of those things, whatever you want to call it, are available. But by the time you get here to the juxtaposition, it's looking for something else. It's driving towards something else. It's driving towards truth. In other words, truth as a direction. These are the kind of people that, if you can't really tell them something that they can know for certain, they really need to know the truth of things. You can't hide things from them. They're constantly trying to penetrate that and take that out of you. In the transition to the left angle, you end up always in the left angle through the transpersonal, the fact that no fulfillment is possible other than through integration with others. Here we have the left angle cross of defiance. See, the 2-1 is the way. Remember what I've taught you about the nature and the structure of the hexagram. The first line of any hexagram is its truth. The fifth line of any hexagram is what everybody else would like that truth to be. But it doesn't mean that's so. The fifth line with its seduction can lead to expectation. The first line is always going to give you the essence. So when you get here to the left angle cross of defiance, and you get to this fifth line projection, and when you get to the fifth line, you get to the expectation of others, that these are forces that are always defying the standard direction that's going on. They think they have their own answer. They think they have a better principle. They're the ones that are going to defy what the general direction seems to be. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean they're actually defying it. Because they are a fifth line, that is the beginning of this left angle, it is a projection on others that they are being defiant, even when they're not. Even when they're not. So, if you have a line of children that are walking, in a fire alarm or something, and you've got one of those kids that's got the left angle cross of defiance, and they happen to be just outside of the line, and don't realize that themselves because they're not trying to be defiant, they're going to be seen as being defiant, and it's going to be projected on them that they are. The sixth line. Remember the relationship between fifth lines and sixth line in profile. The fifth line is a line of universalization, so it is there to be projected upon, so it has the greatest opportunity to be able to provide or to be able to inform or mutate the other. But it is a sixth line that sits on the roof of the house, particularly in its mid-cycle, that is there to be able to attest to whether or not the fifth line heresy is valued or not. So, for example, in the left angle cross of defiance, if you have a fifth line left angle cross of defiance, they're the ones that are going to be going around saying, we must break this, go this way instead. This is not the right direction. This is not the way to go. Follow me. It's the sixth line that's going to be able to say whether that is justified or not. So when you're dealing with the left angle cross of defiance and you're dealing with the sixth line, that is, you're dealing with the 2-6 and the 1-6, what you're dealing with is the authority to be anarchistic. In other words, when these forces are truly defiant, then there is a breakdown in the direction. Now, by the way, that's normal. All of it is fitting in through the second gate. The second gate never disappears from this formation as we move through from the right angle to the left angle. It's always there. It's all part of the direction. But there's incredible nuances in that. Look at the world that we live in today. We still have people that are living in the Stone Age that are still surviving on this planet. In other words, we have many, many different things that are operating at the same time. So one of the things about the left angle cross of defiance is that it brings a movement away from any kind of status quo in direction. And what it brings out is another aspect of schisms. It brings out slight variations and slight differences. When we get to the 23rd gate, we get to the second variation of the right angle cross of explanation. Now, when we looked at the first right angle cross of explanation, we had the personality sun in the 49th gate. So it was rooted in the revolution, and it was rooted in the violence, and this is where I introduced you to that need for our capacity to be able to kill and sacrifice and its relationship to religion. But here we have a different thematic. We have a different thematic because this cross of explanation is operating through the personality sun in the 23rd gate. And remember that in this context, the 2343 as an opposition in the wheel is also one of those three definitions that are created by opposition. So we have a fixed mind connected to the throat here. This is truly where the cross of explanation takes on its purest nature. The 23rd gate is the gate of assimilation. It is all about explaining oneself. And so this is an essential ingredient. Somebody who comes in on this cross with the sun in the 23, one of the things that you're going to notice about them is that they never stop explaining themselves. There's a joke about individuality. You see, collective awareness. These are all things that are established, so these are things that we are familiar with and already accept. But the moment that you have individuality, you have concepts, you have expressions, you have whatever that are going to be new in that sense. That is, they are mutative. Now, the first time that you hear them, they can sound very bizarre. They just can. You know, the individual, the first time they try to explain their knowing to you, it can come out sounding very bizarre. However, the individual has a kind of mechanism in them that forces them to repeat that. In other words, they keep on telling you the same bizarre thing over and over again. After a while, it becomes familiar. You know, I keep on saying to you there are personality crystals. Now, the first time I said that to somebody, they thought, shit, this guy's bizarre. What are you talking about? If enough people keep on saying it's personality crystal, it's a personality crystal. You see, this is the way mutation works. You see, you don't necessarily mutate somebody the first time. It's like getting into a fight when you're a kid. If you think hitting them once is going to solve it all, boy, it doesn't work that way. Mutation is not like that. Oh, yes, there are mutations that just go bang. But other mutations are just based on this repetition until it becomes less and less and less alien to the collective mind. Oh, I heard that before. And the moment they can say, oh, I heard that before, you eliminate most of the resistance. So when you meet this right angle cross of explanation, what you meet is somebody who's going to perfect that right in your face. They're going to keep on insisting, persisting with what their knowing is, in the hopes that if you hear it enough, you'll get it. I've lived most of my adult life in foreign places. And it's always so amusing for me, people, particularly North Americans, and they're in some situation and they're trying to get the message across to somebody and their voice starts getting louder. Where's the telephone? It gets louder and louder and louder. This is a real individual trait. You say something, and it's bizarre, so you say it again, you say it a little louder. This is all about trying to get the mutation inside of somebody. So forgive these people, because they'll keep on saying it until you're familiar with it, and then you can say, yeah, I know, I heard that before. It's very difficult to be a freak. Anybody that carries individuality knows that no matter what they do, they're always an outsider. And that no matter how mutative they can be, no matter how integrative they may have a potential, in fact, they're always on the outside and always remain on the outside. One of the loneliest one of the loneliest crosses is this juxtaposition cross of assimilation. You see, the individual, based on its own circuitry, is always looking for grace. It's looking for the grace of those that's willing to put up with it repeating the same bizarra at them over and over and over again until they become familiar with it. Here, in the juxtaposition cross of assimilation, is the recognition that the mutations for the other. Remember, when we're looking at the right angle of explanation, they only explain when they have to. They don't explain because they want to. They explain when something bangs into them. They explain when something happens that brings that out. They explain when they need to in order to complete their own self-fulfilling process. But by the time you get to a transpersonal cross, when you get here to the juxtaposition, you have to see that for them, it's very important that that's their way of trying to assimilate. That's their way of trying to fit in, and they try to do that through social skills. In doing that through social skills, what happens to these people is that they have difficulty getting their individual mutation across because they pay the price. They pay the price of allowing the others to dictate the terms. In other words, by assimilating with the other, they hold back on repeating their bizarra over and over and over again at the risk that they will be ostracized and not be allowed to make that contribution. They wait for friendship. They try to assimilate with the other first, then try to bring their bizarra across. If I knew you had thoughts like that in your head when I married you, I never... When you get to the left angle cross, you get to the left angle cross of dedication. Now think about this. You've got a freak mind. And underneath that freak mind, what you have is the 30th gate, the gate of desire, the gate of feelings, and the 29th gate, the gate of saying yes, the gate of needing to make a commitment. Now remember that this is where sexuality began to be a theme. The desire began to be a theme in the first quarter. Here, that desire is sitting on a back burner. It is no longer the sexuality that is the dominant theme here. It's still that 23rd gate and its need to be able to explain itself. These beings are great teachers. They are the ones that can be deeply, deeply dedicated to telling the same thing to people over and over and over again forever. You know, I have a 43-23 mind. You know, I know what that's like. You know, I've been telling people about human design for 14 years. There's something inside of that, you know, once you have the mutation, you can just keep on spinning it out. In this case, you have it as a foundation, as the nature of their cross. And these are people that are dedicated to explanation to the other as a fulfillment of themselves. So they can make a deep commitment in their life, to be able to help others to be able to explain. And that's basically what this cross is about, to be able to help others to be able to explain. When we move to the 8th gate, we get the need for contribution. Remember something about the nature of the evolution of civilization is that the evolution of civilization is not simply a matter of being able to coordinate the efforts of humanity or your society, but it's also about having place for mutation so that the structure of the civilization evolves within itself. That the moment that you bring in such the individuality here, the 8th gate, the 14th gate, it's very important to see that this right angle cross of contagion is all about the need to make a contribution, and to be able to make a contribution that's going to bring security and wealth. Now, contribution is to be an example. In other words, this is about taking individual responsibility. That's very, very different than the collective tribal responsibilities or the direction towards bringing the tribe together that we saw in the first quarter, this is something different. In other words, this is about being an example because it's examples that can get others to make commitments. The other thing is that if you're living in a communal environment, that only the individual is going to be ready to take the risk to enter into something different, make a contribution in a different way, which may then lead to the rest of the community accepting that and adding that to whatever is involved in that process, whether it's a change in architecture or it's a change in the way in which the society is structured. Because it is the cross of contagion, it never leaves behind the desire, and it never leaves behind the expectation that desire brings. One of the things about the very beginning of this cross is that you have the 14:1, which is the line that money isn't everything. In other words, this is an example and dedication of resources. You know, this is one of the things that you see in, the kind of pioneer spirit where a community would get together and dedicate their time to build somebody's barn for them. But somebody has to be the example. Somebody has to set that off. Somebody has to go out and do that. In other words, here in the cross of contagion, what takes place out of this cross is always there to impact on others. It's always there to deeply influence others because it can. It is contagious. So this individual contribution to be an example becomes something that's very important. It's also a civilizing step. If everybody can be an example, then less force is necessary to keep everybody constrained to the rules. In the juxtaposition cross, the whole thing about the fourth line is in its fixedness, its capacity to be able to influence. And of course, in this juxtaposition, what we have is that the 30 and the 29, the desire and the readiness to make a commitment is being replaced, and it's being replaced by the 55 and the 59. That is the gate of spirit and the gate of our sexual strategies. The juxtaposition cross of contribution. Now obviously these beings, given that name, they come in on this cross and they are, they're forced in their life to contribute to society in any way that they can. In the modern world, what you see is that, they get married and they buy a rundown old place and they fix it up. I mean, that's the mundane level of this. They may end up fixing it up forever. They keep on improving it and they keep on working on it and they keep on making it better and they keep on making their contribution to all of that. It's always going to be tied up with sexuality because it cannot escape the 59. One of the ways in which this operates is that when you move to the left angle cross, and you move to this left angle cross of uncertainty,
Hi.
the whole idea of making a contribution begins to break down. This cross of uncertainty, because it brings fear. And it brings fear that's rooted in the emotional system in the 55th gate. The fear that one will never get out of the darkness. The fear that no matter how much one civilizes, one can never get rid of the beast that's within. That the beast that's within is the power of the 59th gate that keeps on calling one to find one's spirit through sexuality. That left angle cross of uncertainty is where we have the root of something very odd, the dowry system. All dowries are rooted out of this cross. In other words, that there is a material contribution that needs to be made in order to secure the right spirit and intimacy. You know, give me 75 sheep and your daughter and I'll be happy. I mean, this is where that comes from. In order to be able to deal with the real uncertainty. And the uncertainty is all rooted in the 55th gate, the gate that's going to be part of the sleeping phoenix. And of course, in dealing with that 55th gate, we know that it is a very, very moody gate. 3 of the 4 gates of this left angle cross are individual, so you know there's going to be a great deal of melancholy attached. There's all this sadness. And there's not the first line of the 14 that says money isn't everything anymore. There's just the call of the 14 and its energy. And the call of the 14 and its energy says that, you know, wealth is ours and we must have it. So here we have a very interesting connection that is, rather than it simply being to be able to find your spirit through the sexuality, which is what we had in the first quarter, this is about more is necessary. You know, we're going to have a nice house, you know, with a nice little garden and a little picket fence around it. And in other words, there is a civilizing factor that's placed on top of just the basic sexual drive that says that out of this has to come a contribution, out of this has to come material wealth. And of course, the uncertainty then is based on the unconscious. Is one getting the right partner or not? We come now to the second variation of the right angle cross of the sleeping phoenix. And the moment that we come to this, we come to the sun in the 20th gate contemplation. The 20th gate is the only existential gate. And with the sun in the 20th gate, we have the earth in the 34th gate, so we have the definition of the channel of charisma. And we have the direct connection of the sacral center to the throat. You know, one of the basic formats, in the sense of one of the basic structures of being human, is being a manifesting generator. The vast majority of all couples are manifesting generators. And here, in this definition that is in opposition, you have this primary manifesting generator. Remember that when you're looking at the 2034, what you're looking at is something that says, I know I am busy now. That's all. This is about being busy. This is about getting things done. And again, we have a real shift here because, of course, when we looked at it in the first quarter, we had the personality sun in the 55th gate. That the whole cross was operating out of the moods. The whole cross was operating out of whether that spirit was going to be there or not. This is very different. You see, this is the cross of the sleeping phoenix, in which being busy is a way of being asleep. These are people that are just busy. They're just busy. They don't know why they're busy, but they're just busy. And they know they have to be busy. And there's nothing for them to do but be busy. And they won't stop being busy until that mutation takes place in the 55th gate. But they're going to run around and they're just going to be busy. Now, yes, they may get busy with sexuality. And they may get busy with being depressed, because you're dealing now not only with 3 of the 4 gates being individual, but you're dealing with an individual definition in the integration channels to the throat. So you're dealing with a very, very powerful melancholic field. You know, these are people either busy being happy or busy being sad. But they're totally absorbed in that. One of the things about it is that it's a deeply superficial incarnation. And when I say that, again, no morality in that. In other words, that is exactly what that ride's about. That cross, after all, isn't going to function properly, isn't going to function the way it was meant to function until the mutation takes place and the mutation clicks in. Until then, there's so much going on within the context of that cross that those that carry it are totally unaware of. And this is the most extreme version of that. By the way, you can take that a step further, because the moment that you step into the juxtaposition, you get to see that, this is the most existential cross of all. You have the juxtaposition cross of the now. And the 55 and the 59 disappear, and you have a very unusual configuration. You have two definitions formed by two of the oppositions. You have the 4037 and you have the 2034. When I say that this is the most existential of crosses, they are so in the now that they're not here. They are so absorbed in the now that they're just not here. It reminds me of a Jorge Luis Borges story called Funes de Memorias, about a man that every time he looked out the window, everything he saw he remembered in absolute detail, and the moment he would try to remember anything, it would take him forever. He'd remember every blade of grass, he'd remember everything. So these people are so absorbed in the present, they have no sense of the past, and they have no sense of the future. Now, they can be very disturbing, particularly when they're children. Remember that, one of the things that I have trained myself to do is that whenever I teach or whenever I do a chart, I always remember the child first. It's so important. You look at those white centers you've got and understand what it...
כן, 40 נכנס, 37-40 נכנס כבר מבחינת האלים. אנחנו פשוט נמשיך את זה בהקלטה הבאה, כשאנחנו עוברים פה למיטות להרמוניה ומקלי למיטרה ומאיה ואתרוג. אז זה בהקלטה הבאה. ה-37-40 בדיוק עובר. רק עם המשקפיים אני יכולה לראות. אז נעשה... ניקח משהו לקרוא. חיפוש האמת אחר גוגל. באגם. מת. עידו לא יודע. כל הזכויות והחובות. והפוך. האלצהיימר. בטח אני מקריאה את זה כבר מלא פעמים. מוכן? לקרוא 3 פעמים. מוקדש לך ולך.